There must, even then, have been detail. I must, in that moment, have seen more than I remember. Some movement of sinew and bone, some great leap by that hideous malformed thing. But all I remember of those first few seconds are teeth. Jaws, opened at a span wider than the length of my arm. Teeth that were yellowed, jagged and hard, rushing forwards in a whirling blur, to rip and tear and chew. All I could do was scream as the thing was suddenly upon us. Earlier that morning, whilst I'd been making plans, Paul Whale had been reading a letter. A letter that described seeing a thing that looked like a man, naked and smothered in blood running on all fours, bounding across the moorland. The only explanation I can offer for this is that the sighting took place at dawn, when this thing may have been returning to a form closer to human. Looking back now, I wonder if that was what Whale expected to find down there. A madman, stripped of his clothes and foaming at the mouth, smeared with blood and feces, raving about being a wolf. Perhaps he anticipated some lunatic who, though he believed with every fibre of his being that he had transformed into a wolf, was actually nothing more or less than a man. Perhaps that was what he expected. What he found was something far worse and far from being a man. Whilst werewolf is probably the best catch-all description I can give, what Blackwell had become was unlike any werewolf I had ever seen on screen or in books. Here there was none of the perfectly groomed fur and thick pelts you'd see in Hollywood, none of the well-formed canine bone structure, melded seamlessly and beautifully to the human form. What Blackwell had become was a thing half-made, an unnatural hybrid, an ugly, malformed abomination that should never have been forced to exist. There was fur, but it had not fully grown, on the legs and lower portion in entangled knots, but above the waist it had stalled, sprouting instead in sporadic haphazard clumps, and across the back, the neck and parts of the belly. It had formed in wiry patches of thick black spikes, whilst the rest of the body was bald. Instead of fur, there was raw stretch-marked skin, so pink and livid it looked as if it had been boiled. The overall impression was of a shape covered by not enough material. The skin pulled far too tight across bones of a size and shape it was never meant to have. The thing looked ready to burst. Unlike in Hollywood, where human ears are replaced by two perfect triangles sitting atop the head like those of a fox or Alsatian dog, Blackwell's ears had never really changed but had simply migrated as if pulled and dragged with no regard for what might tear below, upwards to the top of the head, forcing the skin of the face to buckle and fold in rumpled creases, pooling at some points and bulging swollen, purple and red in others. The mouth and nose were no longer human, but had instead thrust forward to form a protruding canine maw. A snout, but not quite, because the nose, rather than resting as a wolf's does at the very end, was instead stretched and pulled across the whole thing. The human nostrils hooked and lengthened, almost to snapping and dragged across its entire extent so that from the side they appeared like two long wounds, gouged from the flesh. All of this I saw in an instant, but not quick enough to move. With a single violent thrust of his arm, Whale shoved me to one side, away from the thing that advanced across the room, and placed himself between us. With a single swipe, he saved my life. Reeling backwards, I tripped clumsily so that I ended up with my back to the wall as a blur of sinews and savage fury leaped toward us, swinging with a taloned hand at Whale, clubbing him to the ground and ripping through both his shirt and skin with a murderous slash that tore the flesh with a hideous popping sound like ripping fabric. As Whale let out his desperate screams of agony and terror, he kicked out instinctively, slamming one foot into the side of the thing's head as its massive neck jerked sideways, but then snapped back toward him. Turning with startling speed, the thing seemed to consider for a moment, knowing it had him trapped. Then, as Whale struggled and tried to regain his feet, propping himself up on a hip and an elbow, screaming the word "please" over and over, the thing's giant maw descended and closed. As I watched in horror, its jaws clamped shut with an audible clack like two wooden chopping boards being slammed together. Its mouth had closed on the top of Whale's skull. Wrenching sideways, the thing dragged him bodily from the floor, flinging him side to side and shaking him like a dog would a ragdoll toy. Whale clawed desperately at this head, wailing and screaming as blood began to course down his face and over his hands, skin and meat tearing to ribbons beneath. All of this took place in seconds, and I knew I had to act. Rising to my feet, I threw myself toward the pair, just in time to see the jaws that had been clamped across Whale's cranium, holding him in that vice-like grip, release and turn in a lightning instant to bite. In one jerking tug, the thing bit off a huge and stringy snatch of meat from the front of Paul Whale's face. The nose, lips, cheeks and an ear vanished in a single shredding rip, off from the bone and into the waiting mouth of the creature, which did not stop even to chew before its hands, like those of a human but adorned with 4-inch claws, gripped again the poor man's skull, the claw of one thumb disappearing into the now empty eye socket as it again pulled the head greedily toward it. I had been screaming, blind and numb with terror. It was all that I could do. I often think that maybe, if I hadn't been so scared, if the thing had not been so quick to pounce, had I not hesitated, then Whale might still be alive today. These are the thoughts that rob me of my sleep. What I did next does not. As the wolf held what remained of Paul Whale in its mouth, I looked it square in the eye and called it by its name. I spat those words, Thomas Blackwell, 3 times, hissing the sounds as if they were a curse. In my reading, it had said only that the Christian name was needed, pronounced 3 times at the creature to break and shatter the curse. Still, for some reason, I screamed both names and repeated them 3 times more, then 3 more again, in the hope that the words would hurt it, whether it was my words or the effect they had. That wounded the thing, I am unsure, but the change, the transformation back to human, was the single worst pain I have ever seen anyone endure. Yet I felt not a hint of sympathy. Not only was I relieved, I was glad. Bones snapped back into place and shrank, the deep marrow within them crushed back into their former shape, as Blackwell mewled and twitched in tortured spasms. The skull, first cracked, then seemed to melt, slowly remolded as if were clay beneath a sculptor's hands, leaving as it did sheets of flabby dangling skin, overstretched and damaged by the snapped elastic change. Blood vessels burst on the surface as teeth, attempting to work back into place, ruptured and cracked as they pressed and pushed against and between themselves, and Blackwell screamed in agony. In less than a minute he was back to himself. A pathetic, wasted wretch of a man, naked, defeated, and limp with exhaustion. Still squealing and weeping, he lay prone on his back, paralyzed and pinned to the floor with pain. But that was not enough. I had read of how to break the curse, how to turn the werewolf back. Speak the thing's Christian name 3 times within its hearing. That much had worked and should have been enough, but I had also read about how to kill it. From that filthy altar, I lifted up the dagger. To kill the beast, strike it 3 times with a dagger on the forehead. I spoke those words aloud, to be sure that he could hear me, so make sure that he knew what I was about to do. Then I approached. From the space beside the altar, I lifted that scrap of my baby sister's coat, and with slow, deliberate movements, looking that fiend in the eye as I did it, I wound the fabric thrice around the handle. Still unable to speak, Blackwell nevertheless begged. His eyes, wide and filled with tears, danced and swiveled madly as he asked, pleaded silently for mercy. Mercy, which I chose to deny. With heavy pounding thrusts, I brought the dagger down onto Blackwell's forehead. Once, twice, stop! The call came from behind. The 2 officers who earlier that night had been at my parents' house were halfway down the stairs. It turned out my mother had noticed I was gone. They had been scouring the streets looking for me and had been alerted to the house both by the screaming from inside and the presence of Whale's dog tied up and barking outside. Before I knew what was happening, one of the officers had pinned me to the ground, preventing me from striking that 3rd and final blow, ending Blackwell's miserable existence. I remember as I lay there, pinned to the ground by the officer and staring up at the ceiling, I heard Blackwell beside me, still gurgling and screaming in a mix of pain and panic. I remember to this day how I burst into laughter at that pathetic werewolf's final attempt to howl. That is all there is of that final entry. Still, I'm sure the reader is wondering about the many loose ends left dangling, so I will try as best as I can to tie them up. Paul Whale was taken to hospital in the city, but unfortunately died from massive blood loss a few hours later. Had he lived, according to legend, he may have suffered in a whole new way. If werewolf lore holds any truth in it, then perhaps his death was a mercy. As it was, he was laid to rest in Moorton Cemetery and was posthumously honoured for his bravery and service in apprehending Thomas Blackwell, who was from that night forward known in the press as the Moorton Werewolf. As for Blackwell himself, he was considered unfit to stand trial based upon his clear psychological derangement, and was instead placed on a secure psychiatric ward where he will remain for the rest of his life. The news reports of the time detailed how Blackwell had killed and maimed his human victims and livestock in the area, believing that he had transformed into a wolf. No mention of the physical evidence, bite marks, footprints and the like that might indicate that his transformations were more than a delusion, was ever leaked to the press. Moorton, it seems, is a town that likes to keep its secrets. Thomas Blackwell was considered responsible for several deaths, including that of Dawn Morley. Save for a few of her teeth, Dawn's body has never been recovered. In later statements given years after the event, Thomas Blackwell claimed to have eaten it. Michael Morley, whose sister was taken and whose handwritten words we have been reading, died peacefully in 2018. He was a good friend of mine and my predecessor as head historian and manager of the Moorton Heritage Centre. It was only after his death that I uncovered his box and read the details I have shared above. I am glad that I did because forearmed is forewarned. Finally, I would like to share my concerns about recent events here in Moorton. The missing livestock, the missing child, the howling. Around 10 years ago, stories and discussions began to appear online about Thomas Blackwell, the so-called Werewolf of Moorton. Threads on sites like Reddit and 4chan began giving details of the case and suggesting that perhaps Blackwell was onto something and not as delusional as the press had reported. How, these tasteless posters asked, could a man take down and devour most of a cow? How could a man eat an entire young girl so that no part of her was ever found? Unless perhaps, these posts, which were, I'm sorry to say, numerous, gave no regard for good taste or respect for Blackwell's victims, and instead seemed to glorify the man as some sort of hero. This would, of course, be bad enough were it not for the fact that some contributors began to probe deeper into Blackwell's story and to link it more explicitly to aspects of black magic that they then themselves started to investigate, with werewolves being once again on trend in the media and at the box office. Some posters with more sensationalist mindsets began not to suggest, but to insist that Blackwell was not as delusional as the newspapers of the time would have us believe, going so far as to declare with notable excitement that Thomas Blackwell had in fact managed to turn himself into an animal, or at least something between an animal and a man, as if they had seen it personally. Far from being repulsed by this idea, many contributors seemed to be positively thrilled by the suggestion and the notion that such a thing might be possible. In the years that followed, articles began to spring up about Blackwell, and someone even did a short video documentary on YouTube in which they suggested, rightly or wrongly, that the Werewolf of Moorton was a bona fide werewolf. Again, they do not seem to be outraged by this idea, but were instead actively glamorizing it. In 2019, transcripts were released of interviews with Blackwell. These were compiled from both police interviews, which should never have been leaked, and interviews conducted by journalists who arguably should never have had access. In them, Blackwell explains, step by step, what he did and how he did it, and expresses nothing that would come even close to remorse. Later that year, we began getting the first tourists to Moorton who had come specifically looking for a werewolf experience. They visited places mentioned in Blackwell's interviews and asked for the whereabouts of what they called the Black House, basically the cottage in which Thomas Blackwell used to live and where he performed his rituals. On the few occasions I have been questioned about this, I have taken great pleasure in explaining that the house burnt to the ground over a decade ago. A lie, of course, but one I feel no shame in telling. In 2021, a group of Redditors, calling themselves the Blackwell Wolves, claimed to have received letters from Blackwell himself, in which he outlined in specific detail the processes through which he transformed. The group alleged that in these letters, Blackwell, who is still alive and on the ward, provided a recipe and the incantations necessary for them to repeat the process, and chose to change themselves, an invitation they intended to accept. According to their discussions, the event during which they intended to try this transformation, which they referred to as Wolfmonat, would take place on the moors above Moorton and would be arranged for an early date in 2024 to celebrate roughly 50 years since the arrest of Thomas Blackwell. It cannot, I fear, be a coincidence that these proposed events seem to have coincided with a new spate of mutilations, disappearances, and howling. I have, of course, shared my concerns about these groups with the local police. I also hired a private investigator and technical IT assistant to work on providing me with the given names of these individuals before the next full moon. I am particularly interested in learning their Christian names. I live in hope. I hope that our missing child will be found and returned unharmed, that the dead sheep can be attributed to dogs, and that the howls ringing over our town are nothing more than the actions of overexcited teens. I hope, God forgive me, that in the next few years, Thomas Blackwell shuffles off this mortal coil so that his legacy and the work of his pen can disturb the people of this town no more. I hope that when he dies, he's buried or burned, and that his filthy remains are placed somewhere far away from here. Finally, I hope that years from now, when someone opens my box at the Heritage Centre, it contains only one version of The Werewolf of Moorton. I hope and pray to Almighty God that there will be no Part 2,